Hello. Thank you guys so much for your patience as we were just getting started here. I'm so happy to see you all here and for the good experience that we had this morning. And it'll just be a wonderful transition now to the second part of our event, where we're going to have a chance to hear from Dr. Class. But before we do, I wanted to offer just a brief introduction. I want to welcome you all formally to the 2022 celebration of student writing. As I shared earlier, my name is Kelly Blewett, and I direct the writing program here at IU East. So the purpose of celebration of student writing is exactly that: to notice, acknowledge, regard, and celebrate student work. And we started that already with our student showcase out in the lobby of Whitewater in Richmond this morning. And thank you all for your fantastic presentations. It was so good to be with you. And now we have an opportunity to transition to showcasing another online component of the celebration of student writing, an IU press book that features 45 pieces of student work. Now you can see behind me on the screen a link, iupressbooks.pub/celeb2022. And I'm just going to show you, when you go to that site, you'll see this online digital book. And if you click on read book, you'll see a lot, 45 different pieces of work by your colleagues, your fellow students here at Indiana University East. Each of the students in this book was nominated by a professor, and you can click on the chapters and read the words that their professors said about their writing in the introduction. These are just a few of the words: brilliant, fun, a joy to read, a demonstration of real intellectual curiosity. And as we look at this table of contents, we can see just a range of topics. We see research explorations. We see literary analyses. There's also magazine articles and even investment reports. So students are doing a lot of different kinds of work here at IU East, and faculty across the disciplines are interested in that work and in celebrating that work. I said we have about 45 student samples in the book from 40 student writers. There were over 120 students nominated for this event. So I just want to say thank you to the faculty who nominated students for inclusion in this book. I want to encourage all of you to go and check out this excellent book and to read those words of affirmation the faculty share in the introductions and the excellent work that the students submitted. And I want to thank the many people who helped make this press book a reality, including Christy Markham, who's here today and who is my co-editor on the press book. So I'd just like to give Christy just a quick thank you so much, Christy. In addition, Kaylee Irvine designed so many of the wonderful materials, the press book cover that we're using in this event. And we had a number of faculty from the writing program who helped copy edit and bring the book together: Rena Holcomb, Jackie Kauza, Lisa Marling, Tanya Perkins, Angie Smybert. Thank you all very much. And I'd also like to thank Deans Darren Snyder and Karen Clark of the Humanities and Social Science School and the School of Nursing, who supported this event by bringing our keynote speaker, Dr. Perry Class. And thank you to the students out there who wrote, because this day is really to celebrate you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Carolyn Judd, to introduce Perry Class. But before I do that, I want to speak personally for a moment about my experience of reading Dr. Class's book, A Good Time to Be Born. 2 weeks ago, my children, all three of them, ages 11, 9, and 1, were diagnosed with strep within a 12-hour period. 24 hours after that, thanks to their antibiotics, they were no longer contagious. Dr. Class's book reminds me how this experience is unique to this historical moment. Had I lived 100 years ago, I would have watched and waited to see what happened next, dreading the development of scarlet fever, a disease that killed so many children. I would have waited to see a telltale rash that preceded the fever. And if my children got the fever and recovered, I would have been watching for lingering effects that could impact their health for years to come. So reading Dr. Klass's book, A Good Time to Be Born, fills me with gratitude for the progress that science and medicine have made that has tangible impacts that we experience daily as parents and caregivers and nurses in this country. And I just think, you know, that's a great thing to remember at this moment in our history, at this moment of uncertainty and fatigue, as so many of the nursing presentations shared, burnout, to remember where we've come from, the gains that have been made, the benefits that we have. It's just a message of hope that we need these days. And that's just one reason that I am so excited that Dr. Klass is with us today. And I will turn it over to Professor Carolyn Judd to share a bit more. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Blewett. As Dr. Blewett indicated, I am Carolyn Judd. I am a lecturer in the School of Nursing here at Indiana University East. And for a little over a year, I have been looking so forward to meeting today's speaker. As a nurse who's worked most exclusively in the public health and child health arena, just being in the same room with greatness touches me on a deep level. So please allow me to give you a brief background of our honored guest. Dr. Perry Klass is a professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University. She is also co-director of NYU Florence in Italy. She practices pediatrics at Bellevue Hospital. She attended Harvard Medical School and completed her residency in pediatrics at Children's Hospital in Boston. Her new book, The Best Medicine: How Science and Public Health Gave Children a Future, is an account of how victories over infant and child mortality have changed the world. We in this room know that book as A Good Time to Be Born. Quirky Kids, Understanding and Supporting Your Child with Developmental Differences, which she co-authored with Eileen Costello, another physician, was published by the American Academy of Pediatrics in a new edition in 2021. Perry began writing about medicine and about medical training when she was a medical student. Her accounts were collected in her two books, A Not Entirely Benign Procedure, 4 years as a medical student, and Baby Doctor, a pediatrician's training, which was originally published in 1987 and 1991 and were reissued as classics of the genre in updated editions in 2010. Her most recent book of medical journalism is Treatment, Kind and Fair: Letters to a Young Doctor. And her most recent novel is The Mercy Rule. For many years, she wrote the weekly column, The Checkup, in the New York Times. Her medical journalism has appeared in a wide variety of publications, including the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Smithsonian, Harper's, the Atlantic, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Her other nonfiction, which I'm anticipating will be my new favorite, includes Every Mother is a Daughter: The Never-Ending Quest for Success, Inner Peace, and a Really Clean Kitchen. She co-authored that with her own mother, Sheila Solomon Klass. Perry is the National Medical Director of Reach Out and Read. She ran the National Center from its inception through 2006, during which time the program grew from a single site to a national program with thousands of sites serving millions of children. Through her work at Reach Out and Read National Center, she has trained thousands of medical providers in the ROR strategies of early literacy promotion. She has spoken extensively on behalf of ROR, including participating in panels at the White House Conference on Global Literacy in September of 2006, and at the UNESCO Literacy Conference in Qatar and Mali in 2007, in addition to presentations at many hospitals and academic medical centers across the United States. Through her work with Reach Out and Read, Perry has been able to integrate her commitment to healthcare of young children with her love of the written word. In an essay on the program, she wrote, "When I think about children growing up in homes without books, I have the same visceral reaction as I have when I think of children in homes without milk, food, or heat. It cannot be. It must not be. It stunts them and deprives them before they've had a fair chance." Perry has received numerous awards for her work as a pediatrician and educator, including the 2007 American Academy of Pediatrics Education Award, which recognizes her educational contributions, which have had a broad and positive impact on the health and well-being of children, and the 2011 Alvarez Award from the American Medical Writers Association. In 2016, the American Academy of Pediatrics honored her with the Arnold P. Gold Foundation Humanism in Medicine Award, citing the impact that she has made through her writing, service as an educator, and leadership in promoting early literacy through Reach Out and Read. In April 2021, Perry was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please help me welcome to the podium, Dr. Perry Klass.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Judd, Professor Blewett, for the invitation, for the opportunity to be here with you. And thank you all. I have to tell you, I feel really emotional being here. I feel emotional for a couple of reasons. First of all, because we are celebrating writing. And celebrations like this, opportunities to travel and be together. You just heard in that extremely generous introduction that I've done a lot of traveling and speaking, not in the last couple of years. Opportunities like this, chances to actually acknowledge people in person, hear the kinds of presentations that we've been hearing this morning, go back and forth, see the way that your passion, your compassion comes across. Those have been rare, and it's a privilege to be here with you. And it's also, I've somehow ended the slideshow, by the way. No, that's all right. I've got it back. You want to see if you can get my slide? Also, I'm well known for my technical abilities. It's possible this auditorium will never work again. But what I was going to say is that, there you go.
Whoops.
There you go back. That's perfect.
Do you want me to start back here?
I just want to go to the first slide.
Yeah,
There you go.
There you go.
There you go. And because, but also, I mean, I just have to say, looking out, talking to people, seeing you, thinking about nursing, thinking about all the topics that we've been talking about compassion, about the connection to the people that you take care of, about what drives people to do this work, and putting that together with writing, having a chance to look at the student writing samples in the online book. It's very powerful and it's very meaningful. I'm very, very happy to be here with you. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my own journey as a writer, the kinds of writing that I've done and how the writing and medicine have mixed. And then I'm going to try to come relatively quickly to the subject of the book and talk to you a little bit about some of the topics in the book and about trying to write about those topics. Happy to answer questions on any of this or on literacy promotion and Reach Out and Read, a subject on which I can also talk forever. So one of the things you heard about was that I wrote a book with my mother. My mother was a writer, and my mother was a passionate writing teacher all her life. She taught writing at Manhattan Community College, and she loved teaching writing, and she was evangelical on the topic. If my mother were standing here, and I wish she was still here, and she were talking to you, what she would say to you, and she would really mean it, is, you have a story nobody else can tell. You have a voice. You have things that you can teach the world and tell the world. Take the time, learn to write. And so I grew up in a family of writers. And in my house, if you wanted to get out of walking the dog, you could say, Mom, I just had the greatest idea for a short story. And she would fall for it every time. She would walk the dog for you. You could compare it to growing up in a house of people who are passionate about music. And you might not think that every kid was going to be a professional musician, but you couldn't imagine how a kid could grow up without playing an instrument or singing. So writing was like that in my family. It was not what you were supposed to do necessarily to earn a living. Everyone needed a day job. That's why I went to medical school. But of course you would write. That was part of being in the world. And I wrote short stories and fiction all my life, and I loved science and biology, and I wanted to be a doctor. And it never occurred to me that I thought of it the way you would think, I want to be a doctor, but I want to keep playing the piano because I love it. They're two different things. And then when I was in my first year of medical school, I sold my first short story. This is after hundreds and hundreds of rejections, and I saved every rejection slip, even though they were mostly just printed things that said, sorry, can't use this. First year of medical school, I sold a short story to a woman's magazine called Mademoiselle, and they decided to do an issue on being female in the first year of law school, medical school, and business school. It was a little more unusual then, with that so many women were going for professional training. And the editor said, oh, I know a woman in the first year of medical school. I just bought a short story from her. Let's ask her to write it. I had no idea what I was doing, but I thought, okay, I'm a woman. It's the first year of medical school. I can do this. I wrote the story, and I sort of told a lot of stories about the first year of medical school. And what I mostly said, and I don't know whether people in nursing school will identify with this, that it felt a lot like high school. It was a group of the same people. We showed up every day in the first year. We sat in an auditorium like this one, 150 of us, and we sat there all day, and people came and lectured to us from 8 in the morning till 5 at night. And we sat there together, and it was like, look, they're sitting together again. Look, they're sitting next to each. That's the third day. And that's the third. And it was very, very, very tied up. We had lots of strong emotions. I can't believe they put those problems on the pulmonary problem set. We don't have those equations yet. It's so little things that seemed incredibly important. Weird experiences we were having, like gross anatomy, dissecting cadavers. Anyway, I wrote the article, tried to include all of these things, named the article after a famous incident in my first year in which we had all these potlucks, off-campus potluck, married students potluck, women's potluck. At the married students potluck, the head of the Married Students Association found out that there was a couple there who were only engaged, and he threw them out. So this was a little bit of a scandal in our class. And the next day, the coolest guy in our class got up and announced, we're going to have the first annual Living in Sin potluck. For those of you who are sharing these years with people, et cetera, et cetera. And I called the article, The Living in Sin Potluck and Other Tales of the First Year of Medical School. And the editor called me up and said, you made it sound like medical school, like medical students are friends, like they have social lives. Everybody knows it's brutal and dehumanizing and horribly competitive, and medical students are terrible to each other. And it was like, basically they made me cut out all the jokes, right? Everything that was intense was okay and stressful and everything. And that was my first try at ever doing that. And also it was a chance for me to realize people actually think they know about this stuff, and they don't. It's more complicated, it's more interesting. So when I found myself pregnant in the second year of medical school, or actually I very much wanted to be pregnant in the second year of medical school, taking the class in reproductive pathophysiology, learning everything that could possibly go wrong, right? Nobody ever mentioned the possibility that things might turn out okay. I wrote a query letter to the New York Times Magazine saying, this is weird. It's weird to be pregnant and learning everything that can go wrong, and will they ever teach us what goes right? And I ended up writing a story about bearing a child in medical school. And I thought, this is interesting. I'm going through some stuff that most people don't go through. And I ended up getting the chance to write what was then called the HERS column about being a medical student. I think I was the youngest person who'd ever written this column. And if you look at the first column, it begins with the sentence, there's a first time for everything. It was about something that I'm sure you can identify with, drawing blood for the first time and who's on the other end of the needle, right? It was about the fact that you have to do everything for the first time in training. And then that other column I wrote about crying in the hospital, and how scared we all were that we would cry, and how inevitably we did cry, and what it meant. And when that column was published, and this is before the internet, I got hundreds and hundreds of letters from people in medicine, in the clergy, in the military, telling me stories of times when they had cried in a professional context and what it had meant. And I learned so much. And I began to think about the ways, not only that I had a story to tell out of my own training, but about the things that I was so focused on my own training, it didn't occur to me that, say, if you're training to be a chaplain or training in the clergy, you're not supposed to cry, and what do you do when you do, and all of the other possible connections. I still have that box of letters. They mattered so much to me. And then, because I kept writing about medicine, I got to do something else. I got to learn how to be a reporter. I got to learn how to come up with a topic which I didn't necessarily know anything about, like drowning prevention, and call up the experts. And that's when I found out that what you really want to do is you want to call the doctor or the nurse who works in this field all the time and say, talk to me the way you talk to families. What do you actually say to families when you're talking about how to keep kids safe, when you're trying to break bad news? How do you do it? And that there's expertise out there. People have thought so long and hard about their connections, about these subjects. It's a joy to not just be writing out of your own expertise, but to be saying to the experts, okay, are you see the one you see there, the column on kids who reached puberty during the pandemic while they were home and are going back to school with totally different bodies. Are you seeing that in your office? Oh yeah. People are seeing what are you asking? What are they saying? What are the parents saying? And I just want to say a word. I want to say a word for the joys of fiction, a word for the joys of personal essay, but also a lot of words for the joys of research and learning things that you don't know and thinking about how you can convey them. And that brings me to this book, which was not like any other book. It's not a personal, it's not a memoir, it's not an account of history. I got obsessed with this subject. And the reason I'm going to try to show you, this is where the cover comes from. It comes from a poster in 1918 for the Children's Year. The US is involved in the First World War. They're worried that with all of the people going off to war, kids are going to get pulled out of school and sent to work. And the campaign is to keep kids healthy, keep kids in school, even in a time of war, more recreation, more activities, more education for parents. So this is what I was obsessed with. This is child mortality, deaths by the age of 5 throughout history. This takes you back as far as 1800, but it was like this before. 40%, more than 40%, more than a third, almost a half of the babies born are not living to their 5th birthday. They're dying in childhood, dying in infancy. It's a fact of life. Doesn't matter if you're rich, doesn't matter if you're royalty, doesn't matter if you're, it's always generally better to be rich than poor, although not always. Because frankly, if being poor means that you're nursing your baby may have better odds. But it's everybody, nobody's immune. So when you think about that, you can see it if you walk through old cemeteries and you see the little tombstones or some of these memorials in the shape of a cradle or a baby's bed, or the family gravestones in which you see multiple children dying. It was a fact of life. It was a fact of being a parent. It was a fact of being a medical provider who took care of children. This is what the infant mortality rate in this country looks like across most of the 20th century. Starts in 1915 because that's when we started counting. This is the ratio you know. Infant mortality is the number of babies who don't make it to the 1st birthday out of every 1,000 live births. So to get that rate, you've got to be counting and registering all the live births, and you've got to be counting all the deaths. And nobody was doing that in that way until the 20th century. So that's one thing that's interesting. If you go back to the beginning of that graph, around 1915, 1920, that's not far away. That's my grandmother's moment. That's the moment when my grandmothers were walking around the tenements of New York, having their babies, who include my mother and my father. Okay, that's a moment when more than 1 out of every 10 babies born is dying before the 1st birthday. And there are plenty of diseases that can come when you're 2, when you're 3, when you're 4. But that's a moment when if you gather a group of adults around the table and you go around the table, everyone at the table is going to have lost a baby, lost a sibling, a good friend who died in childhood. It's going to have touched everyone. And When I trained in pediatrics in the 1980s in Boston, no child was supposed to die. Any pediatric death was a failure. There should be better safety legislation. There should be rules about car seats. We should be able to we should have diagnosed the infection sooner and started antibiotics. And even the things that we couldn't fix, that's the most extreme congenital cardiac malformation. They can't fix that yet, right? Everything was a challenge. It was sort of our failure. That's not how you could have practiced as a physician, as a nurse. That's not how you could have thought, going back to what Dr. Blewett was saying about, strep. It's not how you could have thought. And I was just wanted to go back to both what that change meant and to what went into making that change happen. I just want to say, because we can never talk about this subject without saying it, we don't just have one infant mortality rate in this country. If you look at the infant mortality rate nowadays by race and ethnicity, you'll see that it's twice as high in the Black community as in the white community. And that there are still even while the rates have come down, the ratios and the inequities have persisted. So you have huge advances in every community in the number of babies saved, but you still see those inequities and disparities. And we talked about that in some of the presentations I just saw. All right, I'm going to jump to talking about a couple of the pieces of that infant and child mortality, which was gone, and a couple of the people I learned about when I was writing the book, who I was so impressed by. I'm going to start with every pediatrician's favorite topic and what you really want to hear about, infant diarrhea. Which was called cholera infantum, summer diarrhea. Summer would come and babies would just die in massive, massive numbers. It's not cholera. Cholera is a real disease. Cholera infantum just meant summer diarrhea. And if you look at old medical books, you'll find very evocative texts that anyone who's worked on a pediatric ward and seen a dehydrated baby will know, where a child leaves off nursing and looks languidly about in a comparatively stupid and pitiful manner. The eyes lose their luster, right? We all know what this looks like. We still worry about it when babies get sick, and we say to the parents, the fever's not going to hurt, the cough's not going to hurt, got to keep him drinking. Now, this particular illness, nobody knew where it came from. Was it noxious vapors? Was it decomposition? Some people blamed it on poverty, although it occurred in wealthy families as well. So the first heroine I want to mention, Dr. Rebecca Davis Lee Crumpler, who's the first Black woman to get a medical degree in the United States. First thing I want to say about her is these are not her picture. We don't have any picture of her. If you find a picture of her on the internet, someone's using a random picture of a 19th century African-American woman. Unfortunately, we don't have her picture. No real photo exists of her. She's an amazing figure. She's born in 1831. She works as a nurse, and the doctors she works with recommend her to the New England Female Medical College, though she faces a lot of prejudice there. She graduates in 4 years as a doctoress in medicine, which is the degree that they give. That's the New England Female Medical College. And I kind of got obsessed with her. This is the plaque outside her house in Boston, which is on the Women's History Trail there, where she did see patients, but she not only practiced and saw patients in Boston. At the end of the Civil War, she had the chance to go down to Virginia and practice in a large formerly enslaved population. She saw more different kinds of populations, urban, rural, kids who'd grown up in different circumstances. This is around the corner from the African Meeting House where her house is. She was the first Black woman to get a medical degree. They've counted 54,543 physicians in the country, 270 of them women, all white, and 180 of them Black men. And she wrote a book. She published a book of medical discourses, and she dedicated it to mothers, nurses, and all who may desire to mitigate the afflictions of the human race. This book is prayerfully offered. And so I don't have a picture of her, but at least I've got her book and her dedication, and I've got her voice that way. And she said that people say that the cholera infantum, the diarrhea, is caused by poor milk, bad air, tenement houses, or she pointed out when it affects those of all conditions in life, rich, poor, Black, white, then they say it's some atmospherical phenomena. What else went into beating back this summer diarrhea. Milk stations, here's one in New York, where purified pasteurized milk could be made available. What was happening in the summer? What was happening in the summer was that people didn't have refrigeration, milk spoiled, water wasn't pure. We talked about this at one of the presentations this morning. Here's another milk station. So one more heroine, Dr. Josephine Baker, who was the first director of the New York City Bureau of Child Hygiene, tortured by what happens in the summer, the dysentery epidemics in the summer, lean, miserable, wailing little souls. The babies carried off by diarrhea. In 1908, she decides to do an experiment. She uses 30 school nurses because it's summer and there's no school, and a set of tenements, and the nurses go visiting the newborns. They talk about breastfeeding and hygiene and ventilation, and that district has 1,200 fewer deaths than the previous summer. Everywhere else, the same death rate. And what she says is, I had learned one certain thing: heat did not necessarily kill babies. Okay, 1908, it's about 100 years ago. And you have the doctor in charge of the health system learning that heat doesn't have to kill hundreds of babies every week. Here are her troops, the visiting nurses at the Henry Street Settlement on the Lower East Side in New York City. Here are the nurses from the Lincoln School of Nurses, founded in 1898 in the Bronx, because many of the nursing schools would not admit Black women. Those nurses would go on to do amazing work in the cities, New York and Philadelphia, especially in the Black community, with infant mortality, with tuberculosis. The school graduated over 1,800 women. Here's their class of 1947. And I was going to just, in honor of you guys, tell you about two of those nurses and the work they did. One is a woman named Elizabeth Tyler, who trained at that Lincoln School, and also at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which grew out of that work after the Civil War, founded a settlement house on 62nd Street in New York to provide health care to the Black community. And then she goes to South Philadelphia, and she works in TB, but she also starts working in health and education. Look at this. This is a little mother's club. That other doctor I showed you, Josephine Baker, that's her idea. So many little kids are taking care of even younger siblings. It's a fact of life. Let's start clubs for them and teach them hygiene, teach them safety. So what you see there is the nurse, Elizabeth Tyler, with a doll and a group of children at a little mother's club learning how to take care of babies safely. The other nurse I wanted to mention was Jessie Sleet Scales, who lives all the way up to 1956 and trains in Chicago, and again does a tremendous amount of work around tuberculosis, bringing families to medical treatment and medical treatment to families. That's the era in which she grows up and trains. And I'm going to just read to you a sentence from the article she publishes in the American Journal of Nursing in 1901, 121 years ago. I've endeavored to search out the families in which there was sickness and destitution, visited 41 families, made 156 calls, and look at her list: 9 cases of consumption, 4 cases of peritonitis, 2 cases of chickenpox, 2 cases of cancer, 1 case of diphtheria, 2 cases of heart disease, 2 cases, and on and on and on. I have given baths, applied poultices, dressed wounds, washed and dressed newborn babies, cared for mothers. So what I want to say to you, what I wanted to say in this book is, this might be the greatest thing we've ever done as a species. Take ourselves from a species where 40% of the kids, 35% of the kids, 33% of the kids don't make it to the 5th birthday, and get to a place where we can look at each other and say, children should not die, babies should not die. If there are babies dying, there's something missing, we're doing something wrong, it's on us. We need to provide better support to families. We need to reach out to communities better. We need more education, but the possibility is there to look out and say, children should not die. This is an amazing achievement. It took science, it took bench research, it took public health, it took hygiene, but it also took parent advocacy, and it took doctors and nurses and caregivers who could turn the paradigm around, look at things differently, connect with communities and with families who had not necessarily been heard, and apply that to making the world safe. Because I guess what I would say is, what I learned from writing this book is, first of all, yes, what I just said to you, I think this might be our greatest achievement as a species, that we did this. But it wasn't one campaign. It wasn't like, Let's stamp out polio. Everybody get in line. It was all of these different pieces coming together. And the lesson that you learn from it over and over is you don't make children safe by building a wall around your house and saying, okay, this house is safe and my kid is in there. Doesn't work. We learned that over and over again, right, over these last 2 hard years. You make children safe by making the community safe, making everybody safe, making the world safe. And that's kind of what you do in pediatrics, but it's also so connected to everything that you've been talking about and thinking about. So again, I would, here's Jessie Scales later on in her life. I showed you her picture when she was young. And I'm going to, this is from Dr. Crumpler's book of medical discourses. It's just as important that a doctor should be in attendance before the birth of a poor woman's child as that he should be present before the birth of the child of wealth. And I'm going to stop on Dr. Crumpler. And I just want to say to you again that what you're part of and what you're doing with the writing, and also those of you who are going into nursing, part of a complicated, unfinished, but ultimately glorious story. Stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to transition now to a time of Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and just kind of say it, share it with Dr. Class. She's going to repeat the question, and that will help our friends who are streaming online be able to follow the conversation a little bit. So we'll just turn it over to you guys for about 20 minutes of discussion.
Okay, so the question was, how did I balance writing in medical school with everything else? And did you say, how did it not stress me? Yeah. Well, I mean, it did stress me, but it also relieved stress. And so I think that probably the same thing is true of nursing training that you could say about of medical education. That is to say, in medical school, they go to a great deal of trouble to collect people with a whole lot of different interests and passions, and you collect students with an extraordinary amount of idealism and often with a lot of experience in service and fascinating hobbies, and then it's like they just try to squeeze it out of you. It's like, that's very nice. That's why we were so interested in you to begin with, but don't think you're going to do that now. But the truth is that in order to get through, you have to hold on to the stuff which got you there. You have to hold on to the passion and the mission. And what I found in medical school, so I'm going to say 2 things. A lot of times when people talk about writing, they, every day I write for 2 hours, or, because you got to do it every day. I've never learned to do that. There are periods of my life when I keep saying to myself, this is all material, I'll use it someday, and then I forget it. There are parts of, some parts of your life work better than others for writing. But what I did find in medical school was that if I came home and I wrote about what happened to me, it helped me make sense of some of the stress and some of the feelings of being useless and some of the feelings of, the chronic feeling of being the least knowledgeable person in the room at a critical moment. Everybody else in the room knew what to do, and I was, sitting there trying not to get in the way. And I didn't succeed. I got in the way. And just sitting down and writing that helped me emotionally. And that sometimes sorting it out and explaining it turned out was interesting to other people, and I could publish it. And sometimes I had a grievance and I wanted to tell, how they had been treated me badly, or they had, done something stupid. And I could give you examples of that. And I got to do that too. It gave me a voice when I didn't have much of a voice. And then the second thing is that it's still true. If I can't sleep at night because I think I did something stupid, if I sent a kid home and I'm thinking, why did you send that kid home? What, you can't call the family up at 2 a.m. now and ask them to go check on her. They'll think you're crazy. Why did you send that baby home? That baby is sick. That baby is blah, 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 blah. I still get up and write it down. It helps me. It still helps. Yeah. So the question was what sparked my interest about child mortality rates. I had been teaching an undergraduate course on children and childhood for some years at NYU, just as a sort of a topics course. I actually co-teach it with my husband, who's a historian who's written about the history of childhood. So he would do the history and I would do the biology. And I began to notice that it would be like in the first paragraph of books about childhood, it would say, and of course, a third to a quarter to a half, a third of the babies died anyway. And I would think, how can we just go past that? Mustn't that have changed everything? I mean, when Dr. Blewett was talking about her children with strep, okay, what was it like to be a parent when a sore throat maybe meant scarlet fever, and scarlet fever maybe meant not only you would die, but your siblings? I mean, what was it like? What was it like to be a provider? What was it like to be in healthcare? I mean, you go into pediatrics nowadays, partly because it's kind of the happy specialty. I mean, even pediatric oncology, more than 90% of the kids recover and live to grow up. Newborn intensive care, it's intense, but all those happy endings in those pictures on the bulletin board of kids in their party dresses, you know, when they're turning 5, who come back to thank you. It's a pretty happy specialty. What was it like when 1 in 3 of your patients was going to die and you had to accept that? And then I just began to feel like children are so often in the parentheses or in the footnotes, but I began to feel like actually, if you look carefully, and I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I say looked at all the presidents of the United States, people's lives were blighted. It was tragic. People never got over it. You know, sometimes people will say, well, you know, parents protected themselves. They didn't love their children the same way. It's not true. If you look back to see what they wrote, 40 years later, people are writing, bury me next to me, my darling baby, so that we can be together forever because we were parted on this earth. And I just sort of, it began to seem more and more to me that, first of all, that maybe we can't understand those parents or those nurses and doctors as well as we might like to, because it's so different, but that it's really worth appreciating how fortunate we are to, as parents, but also in the clinical world, to be able to go at it with this idea that this should not happen, not that it's something we have to accept. Yeah. What made me want to be a writer in the first place? As I say, I grew up in a family in which you just wrote. My mother believes, and she believes that everyone here should be a writer. I mean, she does. She doesn't necessarily, she wouldn't tell you you're going to make a living at it, but she would tell you that, you know, it's a joy and it will add something to your life, and you will find things out about yourself, and that you have stories and poems in you that nobody else has. And I liked it. It's something that, but I learned the message well. I did not expect to make a living at it. I do have a brother who makes a living at it, but he's a Hollywood screenwriter. So that's it. There's a different version. Yeah.
I'm Victorian in the English department here at IU East. I actually researched this from another angle, kind of the literary, cultural, aesthetic angle of children's mortality in the 19th century, hymns they were singing on their deathbed, but also post-mortem photography. And I wondered if you had encountered that in your research. It's a very sad, poignant aspect of child mortality, which is trying to capture the photography of a dead child, realizing this will be the last chance you have to have any kind of photography of them. And it was quite a growing business at the end of the 19th century. I wonder if you could say anything about that, or and thank you for uncovering the medical aspect of this. I'm coming from it from
Sure.
the other angle, but I wondered if you had anything.
So I hope people could mostly hear that, because I won't do it justice, but it was a question most directly about post-mortem photography, which was very popular, not only with parents. People like to have a deathbed photo or a photo of the deceased person. And on the one hand, it's very sad. I used some of the photos in the book. I used Harriet Beecher Stowe's little boy Charlie, who died of real cholera in Cincinnati in the terrible cholera epidemic that they had there in the 1840s. And I there's a post-mortem photo. But what I would say about the post-mortem photos, the photo of the dead child, which, hangs in the living room forever, is it's also part of something else, which is interesting, which is that people who lost children, tragic as it was, they were less isolated. When you talk to people who lose children today, what they will say is that it's tremendous, they're very alone, that you can't ever say, well, I have 3 children, but one of them is no longer with you. There's no way to bring it up in conversation without stopping the conversation. It's such an exceptional, rare, tragic, terrible, unthinkable, frightening event. Whereas I think once upon a time, the idea that you would have a photograph of a dead child or a memorial poem framed on the wall, or that you'd be wearing a locket or a bracelet with a lock of the hair, it was so common that I think probably there may have been some comfort in that, compared to what people describe nowadays in terms of feeling that they can never bring it up, that it can't be said, that it sort of marks them out. There was another question. Yeah. So the question's about the next steps to further decrease infant mortality. And there was a presentation out there about rural. I mean, what we see in this country is we see disparities. We see that geographically where you are, but also racially, ethnically, what community you're part of has a tremendous impact. And why? And why can't we fix that? And it's multifactorial. It's not one thing. Some of it has to do with how people from certain groups are treated when they encounter the medical system, with systemic racism, with people not being taken seriously when they have problems in pregnancy. But the other part of it, it's clear, is your healthcare story doesn't start when you get pregnant. So even if you get good prenatal care to women and good care around pregnancy and around birth, if women in certain areas and certain communities are coming into pregnancy with higher stress, more health problems going in, they're more at risk during the pregnancy. So you've got to fix the healthcare system, fix the prenatal care. And we talked about this in one of the presentations, ways to reach people where they are, ways to get the message out, taking into account people's transportation issues, getting them high quality healthcare. But it can't just start with pregnancy. It's healthcare across the life course, and what's available in communities. And we know it can be done, right? We know there are countries where it's 2 out of every 1,000 babies who don't make it to the first birthday, and in our country it's 6. And we aren't where we should be on those graphs. A lot of it is nowadays. A lot of that infant mortality is about complications of childbirth and complications of prematurity. So what you should be trying to address, but you've got to address it by providing good health care during the pregnancy, at the childbirth, but also before. Yeah. So the question was about having a child in medical school, which when I did it was, notable enough to get me into the New York Times, and is now so routine. I mean, our residents all seem to be having babies, and it's not that it's easy, but I think it's definitely doable. So I had a baby in medical school. I'd been out of school for a couple of years. I thought I was going to be a biologist. I'd been out of school. I was coming back. It seemed like, and so on the one hand, it was kind of like, okay, I'm in school. I've been in school for a long time. I kind of know how to be in school. Maybe we should have a baby. But on the other hand, it was, you could also say it was a completely illogical decision. Neither of us has a steady job yet. We're both still in school. We're dependent on my parents. They're paying my tuition. I'm going into debt. Who knows what this, and having a baby in some sense is probably always just, it's hard to argue it logically. Especially, and it's even harder looking back. It's just like, what a great idea. Let's have a baby. But it was a time with a lot of flexibility, in the sense that medical school, if you take a little longer when you get out, you've still got the same degree. If you need support. And I think the thing that I really realized, and that I would say now to medical students, is if you're going to do this training, there are going to be some points in the training when you're not going to feel like you're doing the best possible job as a parent. Somebody else is going to pick up the slack, and you're going to, you make that as a deal. You say, help me through this. I need to be an intern. I'll pay you back someday. And you have to be willing to negotiate that. Medical school, like many other, it tends to attract people who like to get the A+. And you're not necessarily going to get the A+ as a parent while you're being an intern. You're gonna settle for doing your best, and then you're gonna say very grateful thank yous to your partner or your parents or whoever's helping you through. And then your children will tease you about that for the rest of your life. It's doable. Pediatrics is a place where, I think in medicine, people feel comparatively empowered to mention the fact that they have children. But even so, there's a lot of pressure and it's hard, and you do learn an awful lot about being a pediatrician when you have a child. There are, you can argue that it in some ways helps you learn, but on the other hand, I remember when I was an intern, and I was an intern, kind of in the bad old days before work hours rules, when they could, make you work every third night and then all day the next day. I remember moments in my internship when I was so jealous of the people who could go home, and this was my fantasy, to a small, clean, white room where it would be perfectly quiet, and they would just sit down and stare at the wall, and there would be nobody making demands, nobody crying, nobody asking for it. I had this fantasy. And of course, if you asked them, they probably felt tremendously jealous of the people who could go home to a family. It was just a stressful time, and you kept imagining there's some other way that I could do this, but I think it was hard on everybody. Yeah. So the question was about COVID and burnout and the way that it has had an impact on everybody here, and what my drive is and what keeps me going. Honestly, I think it's been such a hard couple of years. It's been hard on all the people in healthcare, but one of the reasons it's been so hard on all the people in healthcare is watching what happens to the families that they take care of. It's been hard. It's been hard in teaching and looking and sort of watching students struggle with the stresses and the pressures and remote learning and being together. It's been hard. I mean, I think for me, and I would just offer the usual disclaimer, I think I've had it really easy. I don't think I look around when I'm in the clinic at Bellevue, and I look at what the families that we care for have gone through. I think all of us feel, on the one hand, you feel stressed and exhausted, and almost feel embarrassed to bring it up. But in terms of, I think most of the people in healthcare go into this with a sense of mission. Right? You go into this because you think your life will be meaningful because of doing this job. And it's true, your life will be meaningful because of doing this job. And trying to find ways, whether it's through clinical practice or whether it's through taking a break or whether it's through literature and reflection, finding the ways to reconnect with that meaning, I think, is really important. And we talked in several of the presentations earlier, we talked about stress in medical students, we talked about burnout, and we talked about if you take the meaning out, if there's too much pressure and too much stress to get something done as a job, too much of a load on you so that all you feel like you're doing is doling out the medications, and you lose that connection, then it's like having a baby. There's not a rational reason why you say, oh, this is a better job than other jobs. You've got to have that underlying sense of meaning, and you've got to try to reconnect with it. And of course, a pandemic in some ways should have given everyone in healthcare an even stronger sense of meaning, but that pressure and that stress can kind of break that connection if we're not careful. And of course, the other thing I should say to that is I don't believe that should be only our responsibility as people who are working in the field, right? One of the standing jokes now in medicine is, you know, you guys have to, you can't go home, you have to go to the compulsory physician wellness session, right? You have to do your physician wellness modules. It's like, no, don't make me do physician wellness modules. Let me go home and hug my kids, right? So it's not, it should not, you know, and if what you say is, hey, could you fix that electronic health record so it's less frustrating? You know, we have to be able to think about ways to actually make our jobs easier and more pleasant and more rewarding, to be able to connect with that sense of mission. But I think that sense of mission is there at bottom for everyone, or almost everyone.
Well, we are kind of running short on time, but we do have a question from Jean Harper, who's watching online. And she wondered, and I think this is a really nice segue from everything you were just sharing, are there books that you turn to for inspiration, solace, or motivation?
So, you know, I do, as you know, turn to children's books. We, last night, Dr. Blewett and I were talking about Little Women, and we were talking about Harriet the Spy. We were talking about the Anne of Green Gables books. I do turn to those books for different kinds of solace. I found during the course of the pandemic that reading stories from frontline people, even while it was sometimes depressing and sometimes scary, did keep me going, did make me think this is an amazing field. These are, you know, people doing jobs that I don't know if I could ever do, that I need to hear about. I actually taught a course on plagues and pandemics online a year ago during the pandemic spring, and it was fascinating how much reading and talking about historical pandemics and plagues it wasn't comforting exactly, but it did first of all remind you every day about what science can do and where we are and what we had to be grateful for. And it also made us think and talk a lot about some of the sort of ongoing patterns of human behavior in which we recreate in our responses to cholera in the 19th century, pandemic influenza in 1918, COVID. And that was engaging, not always comforting, but stimulating.
Well, I think we'll transition. I just want to share with everyone, Dr. Class is going to be available to connect with you,
totally.
to chat with you for a few minutes as we go out to just in front of the bookstore. And will you please join me in expressing some appreciation for Dr.